Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Delighted to have so many of you here with us tonight. This is the second time we've had a speaker doing his second interview on this. And of course, you may remember we did Tim Smith back in January. It was our second interview. Since then, we've done another 13 interviews. So this is the 16th in our series. And you can and will be able to see Tim's first interview. If you didn't see it, along with the other interviews in this series, are present in our at our YouTube channel, which is a free channel for everybody. You don't have to be a member of Blue and Gray to use that. If you are interested in getting in there and you haven't picked up on one of my emails inviting you to join there, send me an email and I will make sure that you get the access to sign up for our YouTube page there. And you can look at all these, which will also be linked to their tours as we go through. The last time we had Tim Smith with us, who is the professor of history at University of Tennessee at Martin. And Tim has been a real force moving in the Civil War community over the last 10 to 15 years. You can't look in a bookstore without finding his works front and center. It's Shiloh and down around Vicksburg now and so forth. And we were just talking, some of you may have heard, Tim is basically doing a 5-volume series on the Vicksburg campaign, which, considering that Ed did 3 volumes on the main campaign and a few other volumes surrounding it, this is the first big scholarly study of the campaign in nearly 40 years. So it's with great pleasure we look forward to that. Thanks very much for attending, folks, and I hope you'll enjoy this and you'll get a lot out of it. Hi, Tim. Welcome back. I am delighted that we're having the opportunity to talk about your next program that you're going to do. Of course, we are going to do Grierson's raid in August out of Jackson, Mississippi. And for many people who've been with Blue and Gray a long time, we're going to introduce, or you're going to introduce us to your Vicksburg campaign in November in Vicksburg, Mississippi. Heretofore, we've almost always been just Ed Bars and Parker Hills and Bill Shea and a few people like that. But now it's Tim's turn, and he certainly has the scholarship and the bona fides to do this campaign. And with this, I'm delighted that we're going to get started on it tonight. So, Tim, my first question to you is: you started your Western work at and with Shiloh, and a number of years ago, you did a book with Ted Savis on Champion Hill. Now you're well and truly into Vicksburg. What fascinates you about the operations at Vicksburg?
Well, it's a combination of several things. Number one, the purely military aspects of it is such a complex, amazing military campaign, that Henry Halleck himself compared to Napoleon's operations around Ulm. And so it's a fascinating campaign to study, and it literally takes volumes and multiple tours to cover it. So that's an interest in it. Another factor in it was the same with Grierson's raid. It occurred right on my home turf. I grew up right smack in the middle of operations around Vicksburg. You talk about the Mississippi Central campaign that the Confederate Army retreated southward to Grenada, to the Allabushan line. Well, I grew up just south of Grenada, Fort Pemberton at Greenwood. I grew up about 15 miles east of Fort Pemberton, and all of that is just right in my backyard. So that is fascinating as well. And then as I can't remember what I mentioned where in what interviews and so on, but there's definitely a family history part to this. Didn't have anybody that I know of on Grierson's raid. Of course, I didn't have anybody from Illinois, but some of the folks probably no evidence of it, but were affected by Grierson's raid. But I can document numerous ancestors involved in the Vicksburg campaign. One was actually with Featherston's brigade at Fort Pemberton that we talked about. Numerous ones in the Mississippi Central campaign. When you get closer to Vicksburg, I had 4 ancestors inside Vicksburg. 3 of them surrendered, 1 was killed. And then another one marched away with Loring at Champion Hill. So 5 ancestors at least in right smack in the middle of the Vicksburg campaign. So that is an interest as well. So put all that together, and it's just it's a no-brainer that I would be interested in Vicksburg.
You know, you mentioned this, and I remember I've known Parker, of course, for 26 or 27 years, and we have done a lot of battlefield tromping and looking under bushes and stuff in the Vicksburg campaign. And he, of course, when I met him, he was in Jackson with the National Guard. Had gone to school at Southern Miss and was living in Clinton, and still does live in Clinton. And the amazing part of that is that you said exactly the same thing. I mean, how envious can we be of people that are interested in history and then get something of that magnitude? I think comparable would be as somebody living near Omaha Beach or at Waterloo or you know, Gettysburg or Yorktown. I mean, there's certain places that, golly sakes, you know, if you died and the Lord said heaven is full right now, would you like to hang out a while until we can, for a couple thousand years, would you like to hang at Vicksburg? There are some people who are military historians like you that probably say, that's a deal, yeah, I can do it. So,
although it's mighty hot, it's hot down there. But yeah, you're right. But you know, those people that live near parks like that, and I would guess people who live near Normandy or Waterloo, take it for granted a little bit. I live very close to Shiloh and hardly ever go anymore. You know, I worked there for years and years, but you know, people living near Yellowstone probably take Yellowstone a little bit for granted, you know, thinking everybody's got a national park in your backyard. So that's kind of a sad aspect about it. But yeah, what we take for granted, people drive all the way across the country to come see, and
yeah, it was funny because when I was in the Air Force, I was stationed in Guam, and I never took time to look at the Marianas campaign. I mean, Guam, Saipan, Tinian right there. And I was there a year and a half, and I never did it. And of course, once I left, then I've flown halfway around the world to walk and tromp the same areas that I lived in. Yeah. I had the same thing. I lived in the Ardennes, where the Battle of the Bulge stepped off at, and was so busy, never got a chance to go look at the Battle of the Bulge, but have traveled halfway around the world to go back and see it at a place where I lived and so forth. So it's something that if you're a historian, you want to convey that to other people and help them really understand how much it means to literally live in the shadow of history and get to experience it. So after Champion Hill, Grant moves to envelop Pemberton and in Vicksburg. And, you know, you look at that and we know history tells us what it is. But what I'm interested in is, what's your assessment of the Confederate earthworks and the defensive scheme that the Confederates set up to hold the Hill City?
Oh, extremely strong. It's proven that it can't be taken by assault on the 2 days of assault. The lay of the land, and this is one of the things that we'll bring out in the tour itself. We're going to get down in the ravines and tramp those, and following both the assaults and, of course, the later siege approaches as they operate under siege warfare. But the way that it's laid out by Engineer Lockett it's an amazing, intricate maze of ravines and hills and so on that you really, a couple of places, but just driving around the tour route, Shiloh's the same way. You really don't get a view of what things are and how they operate and so on without getting out of your car and tramping up and down these ravines and so on. So we're gonna do that. And so, you know, it's all it needs to be. These earthworks and fortifications and so on are established, put up by Lockett, using slave labor and a lot of soldier labor as well, the fall before Vicksburg, in the fall of 1862. And over the course of the next 4 or 5 months, when they weren't used, of course, they had eroded and rain and all that. But it didn't take just a couple of days for the Confederate soldiers now occupying them to get them back in shape and get them ready. And they are all but impregnable to normal, regular assault. Now, when you get into later siege warfare, when you start approaches and start digging toward them and digging them down, and when you get to the point where you can launch an attack in, like 30 seconds rather than coming across, hundreds of yards of field and so on, that's
Sure.
a little bit different situation, and that gets into the siege. But as far as attacking from a line of battle several hundred yards back, I'm convinced these are all but impregnable, which we see in the Vicksburg assaults.
What's interesting about that, of course, we both walked those fields so many times and for such a long period of time. When you look at it and you see the area outside the park, the old Route 66 adjustments and everything, and you look at this and you consider perhaps Big Black River Bridge, what you've got, Vicksburg, is this huge tête de pont with miles and miles of defensive works in which the Confederates turned their back to the river and put themselves in front of the town with their back to the river, which of course, if you encircle them, you're gonna capture them, but it's not militarily sound to do so. But yet I agree. I think the hills and so forth are so spectacular around there that if you can set up the interlocking fields of fire and so forth, which Lockett did, you've got it's a dead field out there. It's an area that if you come across, you're in deep trouble. And so it's fascinating to see that much earthworks being built and the recognition of what they were going to do with Vicksburg. Perhaps it was involved with Farragut's move up the year before that perhaps inspires them to build even more to defend it.
Well, the whole purpose that there are earthworks in what everybody referred to as the rear of Vicksburg, which we think of as the main fighting and siege and all that. But the whole purpose they were there was to defend the river batteries, the guns, to block the river. And of course, when you set up river guns to block the river, whether it's at Fort Henry or Fort Donelson or Arkansas Post or Vicksburg or Port Hudson or wherever it is, or on the James River in Drury's Bluff or anywhere, the Achilles heel for those fixed earthen fortifications is the turning movement, which the Confederates never quite figured out. And Ulysses S. Grant figured out real quick that all we have to do is to land an army in rear of these guns. And by that time, of course, the Confederates had figured out what they're doing, and they established rearward fortifications. But all you got to do then is either assault and break through, which Grant does at Fort Donelson and so on, or in Arkansas Post and numerous other places, or either wait them out through a siege and eventually force them to surrender. So it's a pattern that occurs over and over and over, and the turning movement is the Achilles heel to these fixed earthen fortifications, which the Confederates have to rely on because they have no navy. They have no way to combat the Union brown water navy that is running rampant on these rivers out west.
You hit a really interesting point, and I want to drill down on this a little bit more, because the essence of understanding Vicksburg and a lot of these other points and so forth is to ask very blunt questions that in hindsight seem obvious, but at the time when we look at what perhaps the Confederates were looking at, the Union looked at, perhaps it was not so intuitive. So I'm going to ask you, based on your years of experience in studying this, and I'm sure you probably contemplated this before, was Vicksburg really defensible? And if you believe it was, why did Pemberton lose the city? Or if it wasn't defensible, why did Pemberton ever try to hold the city?
Well, it was defensible for a specific period of time, and that is what everybody is counting on. That if we get trapped inside the city of Vicksburg, that we have the fortifications to hold us here and not allow us to be overrun, and B, we have enough supplies inside Vicksburg to carry us until some type of relief occurs. And that is what causes the emphasis on Joseph E. Johnston out in farther east. And from the get-go, I mean, from May the 18th, when Pemberton is starting to set up his defenses in Vicksburg, he's starting to call on Joe Johnston. Hey, we're looking for you. Please come quickly and come and relieve us. And messages running in and out of Richmond, and back and forth and so on, are talking about, Pemberton is shut up inside Vicksburg, and the only thing that can save him is the outside relief. And this is historic in and of itself. You look at the siege warfare manuals, written basically translated by Mahan and Halleck and others in American military theory at West Point and so on. You set up the initial line that surrounds the enemy, but then you set up the rearward line that protects your besieging line against an army of relief. And there are certain lines of countervallation, all that technical stuff. But it's the age-old warfare that's being played out here at Vicksburg. And so in that sense, Vicksburg is just like all these other fixed fortifications, whether it's the Atlantic Wall or the Maginot Line or Vicksburg or Fort Donelson or whatever. They're susceptible to the turning movement. And the hope is that if you get trapped within these, that you can hold out long enough until relief can come. Sadly, the trap that the Confederates fall into is the relief never comes. It didn't come at Fort Donelson. It didn't come at Fort Henry. It didn't come at Vicksburg. It didn't come at Arkansas Post or Port Hudson or any of these places. And that is a pattern in and of itself as well, that these Confederate officers keep falling in the trap of losing the army at the same time they're losing the place. The common sense thing is, if you're going to lose the place anyway, don't lose the army. And there are only a couple of Confederate generals that realize this and get out of the place instead of losing the army, losing the place anyway. One is actually Joseph E. Johnston, who never stands to fight enough to lose an army. The other is P.G.T. Beauregard, of course. Corinth is another example of this. He is susceptible to being surrounded and turned and potentially losing an army in the May siege at Corinth in 1862. But he's smart enough, and I'm not a Beauregard fan, but I have to hand it to him at this point. He's smart enough to get the army out to save it to fight another day. So in one sense, Vicksburg is very defensible, but only for a limited amount of time. Ultimately, forever, no.
You make it. You pushed a button with your answer, and it's a good button to push. I didn't intend to ask the question, but you raised the point, and I'm not going to miss the opportunity to go through that door and let you address it. Is that I think the difference in great generals are that they truly understand the national objectives, the national strategic objectives, and the control of the river was important to both governments. And it seems to me that as the Union matured, and you're a Grant guy, I see Grant's papers on your shelf behind you and so forth. As Grant matures and he gets more experience, he understands there are certain things that have to be done politically, and he has to bend his military operations to ensure those political objectives are made. And you just kind of hit the nail on the head with Joe Johnston and Vicksburg and so forth, is that consistently the second tier of officers who just aren't great generals, whether it be Joe Johnston or John Pemberton or so forth, they never get the distinction as to what impact their actions have on the national strategy for winning the war. Grant does, and he wins the war. But these other guys make these fatal mistakes, like you point out. Johnson never comes to help Pemberton at a point in which he could have done so. And it could have turned it into an open field brawl, which may have turned out okay. We don't know. That's speculative, but I think the point that you made is really a good point, is that so many of these people, these fortifications become tombs for poor management, because they hold people's to that point, as opposed to getting the maximum out of what the Army may and should be able to do.
Right. Well, it's the classic difference between Jomini and Clausewitz. And that is part of my working theory on these 5 volumes, that to start out in the Mississippi using pure Jomini theory, focal points, maneuver, secure lines of supply, all of that kind of stuff. He is doing things absolutely by the book, the way his boss would intend for him to do it. And his boss is Henry Halleck, who is Jomini 2.0, And,
that's right.
And so Grant starts that, and John Pemberton matches him step for step in the same exactly Jomini theory, taught at West Point. Both of them are West Point graduates and so on. And you see Pemberton using maneuver, Van Dorn, Forrest in the rear, interior lines of communication. He uses those well. Even in the bio campaigns, you see Pemberton shifting troops here and there to match Grant step for step in this Jominian warfare. Where you get the difference is when Grant starts to move from Jomini and doing things by the book. He throws the book away and he starts doing the Clausewitz type stuff that, Clausewitz says war is politics by another means. Grant understands the politics of this. And so Grant starts to utilize Clausewitzian principles of take the Army, not the geographic points. Let's go after the Army. Let's do things not so much by the book. And Clausewitz wasn't taught, in America. Nobody knew much about Clausewitz. In fact, I joke that Grant was Clausewitzian before Clausewitz was cool. It's kind of like Barbara Mandrell.
Sure.
This country before country's cool. Grant was Clausewitz before Clausewitz was cool. And now Clausewitz is everything. He's cool in the modern Army, But once you start, and here's what is the key of the Vicksburg campaign for me, once Grant starts using these by the book things, like marching down the river and crossing into their rear, and cutting off from a traditional supply line. Yes, Grant has, we can argue over the supply line and so on, but it's not your traditional railroad river supply line that Jomini would have recognized or Halleck wanted. And so that is the key when Grant starts doing things not so much by the book. The other key is when the campaign starts shrinking. Pemberton is able to match Grant step for step when we're talking about a canvass of 4 or 5 states, and it gives Grant or gives Pemberton the time to match, to think and match Grant's movements in terms of Grant having exterior lines of communication. It takes them a while to get from Oxford back to Memphis and down to Chickasaw Bayou. In the meantime, Pemberton can easily shift troops using his interior lines of communication. So when it's on the large canvas, Pemberton is able to when things move slowly, he's able to react in time to match that. When the campaign starts getting smaller on a much smaller canvas, when Grant crosses the river and starts the march northward to Fort Gibson and Jackson and Raymond and all that, Pemberton does not have the ability to think that quick and to react to Grant's moves, and that's when Grant eats him up. It just changes the whole thing.
Sure. Let's move to Grant. After the Big Black River Bridge route, the 15 minutes of Mike Lawler and so forth, the Tete de Pont collapses and the Confederates flee back into Vicksburg. Did Grant miss an opportunity to avoid this siege?
Well, he misses an opportunity to destroy Pemberton's army. Pemberton had no business being out number one, outside the Vicksburg fortifications. If that's the intent, to hold Vicksburg for the time being until something major can happen and we can take care of Grant's army. He had no business being outside of the Vicksburg fortifications, much less east of the Big Black River. But he crosses both and gets beat twice, and then falls back into Vicksburg, of course. And Grant doesn't miss an opportunity. I mean, he tries twice to avoid the siege. That's the whole reason for these assaults. Grant is thinking in a lot of different ways that, if we go ahead and take care of this thing now, we can continue other operations before it gets so doggone hot. If we go to a siege, they're going to have to send us reinforcements, which ultimately the War Department does, all the way from Missouri and Kentucky, the Ninth Corps from Kentucky. And those reinforcements could have been used elsewhere. So Grant is thinking, let's go ahead and get this thing tied up. We got them on the run. We've got them, we're in their head now. And basically Grant doesn't see how the Confederates are going to resist assaults against, Fortress Vicksburg. Ironically, Pemberton doesn't either. Pemberton admits to Lockett, his engineer, that we won't be able to stand the first attack here, and so we're done. We're cooked, and of course they do, mainly because of the fortifications and the terrain, and the fact that Pemberton has two divisions that were left in the vicinity of Vicksburg that aren't caught up in the debacle of Champion Hill and Big Black River Bridge, that haven't lost their morale. I don't think Grant misses an opportunity. And there's been some debate, and Parker and I have discussed this as well, over whether Grant should have launched the assaults or just gone straight into the siege. And General Hills takes it from a soldier's point of view in terms of sparing men's lives. And I absolutely cannot question him on that. He's been there, I haven't, but I also know, I quote Ed Bars, that, a commander has to use his troops in combat. Is just the question of when best to use them, that you sacrifice as few of them as possible in doing it, but you're going to sacrifice troops at any one time. So I lean to the side that Grant was very much within his right and within common sense to launch these assaults, to go ahead and get the campaign over, get it done. And knowing what Grant knew at the time, it was perfectly logical to launch those assaults and see what happened. And of course, we know what happened. And so, no, I don't think he lost an opportunity at all. He went as fast as he could and took care of it as fast as he could. It just didn't work.
History tells us, of course, that Grant and Porter forged a partnership, and that Grant was certainly appreciative of the contributions that the Navy made to the campaign. This may be a chicken or the egg question, but without naval assistance, does Grant ultimately take Vicksburg, in your opinion?
Well, not in the form that he does, because he can't get across the Mississippi River south of Vicksburg. There's no way to get across that. Probably doesn't even reach Vicksburg by the river. Of course, you can send transports, but all those transports are guarded by gunboats. All the commissary supplies and so on are guarded by gunboats, because they're Confederates taking pot shots at them, on the bank of the river, even with cannon and so on. So, not sure it definitely wouldn't have taken the form that he did. There's a possibility he could have taken Vicksburg by going back to the book, as Sherman actually, Sherman railed against this roundabout campaign that he called it. Cutting loose and going south and coming up in their rear and all that kind of stuff. Sherman said, don't do it. It's not going to work. We need to go back to Memphis and do the thing by the book, go across land, go by the railroad, repair the railroad, secure the railroad as we go, and move on down, to Jackson and go east or go westward from Jackson, which would put them at the same place. It's just a matter of getting into position to be able to take Vicksburg. So it's possible that Grant could have done it that way, like he started in the fall and winter of 1862. Had in April or May, had he gone back to Memphis and started overland, who knows what would have happened. It would have been the second time, and Pemberton probably would have learned a lot in the meantime about how to handle this, even better and so on. So it could have been done, but without the Navy, it couldn't have been done in the form that it ultimately was. So the Navy,
Thanks.
I give a lot of credit to the Navy. Very, very important in this campaign.
You raised the issue about should Grant, that you and Parker talked about, should Grant even have launched these assaults? Tell us about Grant's initial assault on May 19th, and why do you believe he failed?
Well, it's not much of an assault. Only one division out of Grant's 4, 7, 10 divisions. Well, and portions of 10 divisions, even makes an assault, and that's Frank Blair's division of Sherman's Corps, right there on the Graveyard Road against the Stockade Redan. There are movements from the others. There's a little bit of fighting here and there, but only one truly assaults. And those 3 brigades of Blair's division don't get very far. The reason they fail is the absolute strength of the Stockade Redan and the terrain around the Stockade Redan. Now, what Grant thinks, and you get into perception, reality, and so on, is this really whatever they think is that the reality? And sometimes it's not. Classic example is at Shiloh. I am absolutely convinced that Buell did not save Grant's bacon at Shiloh at the end of the first day. It just didn't happen. Buell didn't put in enough troops. Grant had it under control. There's no way the Confederates are going to take that last line of defense, even if Buell doesn't show up. But the perception is, and there are tons and tons of Grant soldiers' letters that say Buell came in and saved us. He came in and saved our bacon, and all of that kind of stuff. So looking at it from hindsight, we can see that the perception is not reality at that point. Same thing here. What Grant thinks the reason that he was not successful is the tactics, that we used linear tactics, spread everybody out in a line of battle, shoulder to shoulder, regiments beside each other, and attacked across the board in linear fashion up the hills and so on. And Grant says that is not going to work in this type of terrain. What we need are the attacks by the flank, moving down the road like a serpent moving down the road and so on, and these pinprick attacks like at Spotsylvania, the Muleshoe, Updike and so on. When it Updike at Spotsylvania, the east is not my forte, but at any rate, the pinprick attacks and assaults is what he decides was needed here, and is the difference. And that's by and large the way the attacks are started on May the 22nd. But very quickly that fails as well, and Grant learns, well, maybe it wasn't the assaults. And actually, what all the soldiers do on May the 22nd is go back into linear formation. That's what they know. That's what they're familiar with. So we better protect ourselves and get in the formation that we know. So neither works. The idea of the May the 19th assault is limited. It's proportional in terms of what's coming later. And Grant figures out, okay, if we do this whole thing on a large army-wide scale, maybe we'll have a better chance. And let's take some time to prepare. It was thrown together very, very quickly. That's another issue. Grant issues the orders, and actually in the official records it says 11:16 a.m. when he issues the orders for the charge to take place at 2 o'clock, which doesn't give a whole lot of time to prepare there. So Grant wants to prepare better for the next one.
Certainly, you made a good point. This is somewhat analogous to Spotsylvania the next year, in which Upton launches a very limited operation, and because he achieves some success, the analysis of that is that perhaps if we put enough men into this, that we'll succeed in crushing the point. But with that in mind, why then? I'm struck by all the contradictions in the second assault, and why it, at least on paper, looks like it's supposed to be a broader based assault, but in reality, only the 13th Corps is really fighting hard. And yet again, it almost seems as if you had to lay a piece of paper. It was almost pro forma that if you could get a freebie, if you could go in with a minimum amount of casualties and a minimum amount of effort, you'd take it, if it was given to you, but you weren't willing to invest a whole lot of blood to try to carry these positions. So when you look at the second assault, is Grant to blame for its failure?
I don't think so. I think he had every right, once again, knowing what he knew at the time, to launch an army-wide assault to try to finish this up today. Instead of the next 6 weeks. If anybody is to blame, and I try not to lay blame on people who can't defend themselves anymore, but that's part of the job of the historian, to analyze and to come up with, ideas and narrative and so on that explains this and why things happen. But I think it's clear that Sherman and McPherson's hearts are not in this second assault. They just absolutely is not in it. Their hearts aren't in it. And I think the idea is that we're going to try this. He wants us to try it by, marching by the flank down the Graveyard Road. And so we're going to try it. But we're not going to lose any more men than we have to. We're going to do our duty. We're going to show up, and we're going to try, but we're not going to go overboard on this thing. McClernand, on the other hand, and I think there's just as much blame to go around for McClernand as there is Sherman and McPherson. Probably just the opposite. If Sherman and McPherson aren't quite into it enough, McClernand's a little bit too gung-ho. And actually what he does, he rails to Grant that we've got to do these pinprick attacks. We don't need to attack across the board. And then lo and behold, McClernand attacks with everything he's got across the board. He defies exactly what he's been telling Grant. And then there are other issues, with the reinforcements and calling for Grant, to restart the assaults to support him and all that. So there's plenty of blame to go around with McClernand, with McPherson, with Sherman, and to a certain degree Grant. Although, again, I just can't get around the fact that Grant, knowing what he knew at the time, I'm no trained military man, but I probably would have done the same thing. It's pretty logical.
Well, it strikes me that with the assaults that day, that you're right, McClernand, of course, is all in, and it is a full-scale battle assault with all the resources he has available to him. And it also, again, is a truism, which we discovered again a year later at the Mule Shoe at Spotsylvania. Just because you put 20,000 men into a position, if the position itself is intrinsically strong, to cut off the ability to maneuver and take advantage of your manpower advantages, you find yourself perhaps just destroying a lot of men who need not be destroyed, because the terrain didn't change whether you attacked with one corps or three corps. There were choke points, the Graveyard Road, the Redan there, just the precipitous climb that some of these soldiers had to make to try to take the Stockade Redan is just it's mind-boggling, and you can't imagine it under fire and what it is. And so the question goes back to the point you and Parker again debated, is why the hell did they attack in the first place? Could they have just done fine without it? And with that, after he does these two, then he suddenly becomes enamored of mines and approves these efforts perhaps to disrupt the Confederate lines by mining them. What's your overall assessment? You see the attacks and so forth. What's your overall assessment about Grant's conduct of the siege?
I think it's very well done within the limited capacity that he has. there are a lot of other factors going on. Joe Johnston in the rear, which if you hit Grant on anything, and yes, I'm a Grant guy, but I don't miss an opportunity to hit him when he needs it. And Grant, I think, gets a little bit paranoid about Joe Johnston in the rear, and worries that they're going to come and lift this siege, which is again the logical thing to do that you're taught to do in what little tactical and operational training you get at West Point. Most of it's engineering, of course, but you have that factor. And then you've got obviously the weather and all of that going on. Then you've got the Confederate resistance and fears even of a breakout attempt. Grant's fearing the Confederates inside Vicksburg breaking out. He's fearing Johnston coming from the rear. So you've got a lot of stuff going on. And then another major factor is the lack of engineering officers in the Army of the Tennessee. And all of the engineer reports, and Grant himself and others talk about how we're down to just barely enough engineers, just maybe 2 or 3 staff level engineers that we've got to do all this. And that's just plainly not enough. We need 20 or 30 more. And so Grant issues these orders that anybody with a West Point or even civilian education needs to do collateral duties in terms of engineering. And you need to get out there and you need to figure out where the approaches are going, where the saps are going to go, and where the parallels are, and all that kind of stuff. And he even utilizes his own staff. Some on his staff are West Point graduates who had the training just like he did. And in fact, I believe it's his commissary general, a lieutenant colonel, who, when he issues this orders, sends Grant a note and basically says, I'm afraid the only thing in siege warfare I would be used for is as a sap roller. And he was a pretty rotund guy. And Grant says, well, as the Army needs something to eat, I let him off the hook because I'm sure we would have lost him if we used him as a sap roller. So Grant has this sense of humor, but the severe lack of engineers and what engineers he does have, like Frederick Prime and so on, gets sick during the siege. There you go back to the weather and the water and all that kind of stuff. And so there's a continual revolving door of the engineers and so on. And so if you hit Grant on anything, it probably could have been done several weeks sooner if he had all the resources and people and so on that he needed. It was a pretty slow run thing. But then again, there are mitigating factors that lead to this. I don't think Grant's just twiddling his thumbs and saying, all right, let's just take it easy. He's trying this as much as he can, but there are mitigating factors that slow things down. But ultimately he's successful, which is, the answer to your question, I guess.
Yeah, well, it's nothing.
Okay, thank you very much, Lynn. Tim, to what extent was the fall of New Orleans, how did that impact Vicksburg?
In fact, there's a great, and I couldn't find it right now. I could have looked through my official records here, but there's a great saying, I believe, by Martin L. Smith, who was the initial commander at Vicksburg, that makes the statement that the fall of New Orleans was the immediate propulsion for the fortification of Vicksburg. Everybody was concerned about Albert Sidney Johnston and the line in Kentucky and Bowling Green and Columbus and ultimately back through Fort Henry and Fort Donelson and Shiloh and all that, worried about the Federals approaching the Mississippi Valley and taking the Mississippi Valley from the north, when the real situation here are the Federals coming in from the south. And that's led, of course, by Farragut and Porter and Banks and Butler and so on, coming in through Fort Jackson, Fort St. Philip. And what we find, of course, with the breaking of the Confederate defenses at Fort Jackson, Fort St. Philip, is that once you get past that, kind of like Fort Henry and Fort Donelson in the north, once you get past that, the Confederacy is a hollow shell. There is nothing else to stop the Federal movement northward till you get to basically Vicksburg. And that's why the Union forces under Farragut, the naval forces, moved so quickly. In late April, they take New Orleans, of course, which is defended. There are defenses there, But most all of Mansfield Lovell's troops have been shifted north in the concentration that led to Shiloh. And so he's down to like 30-day militia, and very few of them to defend New Orleans. And he says, there's no way I can defend it, so I'm not going to try and get it shot up. I'm just going to evacuate and let the civilian authorities surrender the city. And so the Federal Navy moves on up through Baton Rouge, through Natchez, and ultimately approaches Vicksburg by late May. And so, yes, the fall of New Orleans is what really gets the Confederate officials' attention, that we've got to have something else here to stop these people, or they're going to go all the way to Memphis and take us in the rear on the northern line. So the fall of New Orleans and the movement up the river is very much the impetus for the fortification and the situation of the Confederate next line of defense at Vicksburg along the Mississippi, or the Southern Railroad from Vicksburg to Jackson, ultimately to Meridian. That line of defense.
Thank you, Tim.
Okay. Thanks. Karen, who is moderating this, has sent all of you a message that you can unmute yourself now, but still to get recognized, I'm going to ask you to raise your hand. Pat Schuber has got a question for you, Tim.
Okay.
Pat, if you're unmuted, go ahead and ask it.
Yeah, excuse me, Tim. My question is on McClernand, who was relieved from command by Grant shortly thereafter. I wonder if you would comment on that.
On the relief of McClernand?
Yeah.
It was a long time in the making. The actual offense that brings the relief is that McClernand published a congratulatory order for the 13th Corps in a newspaper, and regulations say that you can't do that without getting approval from headquarters first. And so McClernand made a very minor mistake, and Grant uses that as the technicality to remove him. Charles Dana says, though, that this congratulatory order business was the occasion, but not the cause of McClernand's removal. And the cause goes all the way back to their first meetings, in Cairo and down to Belmont and through Fort Henry and Fort Donelson and Shiloh, and then all through the stages of the Vicksburg campaign, where Grant and McClernand are just like oil and water. McClernand's this elite congressman who thinks he knows everything and tells everybody everything, and Grant's just this commoner drunk, McClernand thinks of him, who can't hold a job, and how dare he give me orders? I'm the one that should be in charge of this, and Lincoln foolishly made him in charge of it. And so they butt heads the whole time through this. What is interesting, though, to me is that, and I analyze this in the forthcoming Vicksburg Siege book that's coming out next month, Grant has the opportunity to overtake McClernand throughout the campaign. He's gotten orders that he can obviously take over the campaign itself, but even to remove McClernand from Corps command. But Grant doesn't exercise that. Grant doesn't exercise it until June the 19th during the middle of the siege. Why he didn't do it after Champion Hill or before Champion Hill or even the assaults, and especially after the fiasco that was McClernand's calling for more support during the assaults and so on. And I think Grant needed McClernand in a military way. He realized McClernand's a fighter. I mean, he's proven that at Shiloh, at assaults and everywhere. But Grant doesn't remove McClernand until a couple of key factors happen in the middle of the siege. Number one, by June the 19th, Grant has gotten every single bit of reinforcements that he's going to get. So if he's going to remove him, he's not going to do it until he has all the troops that he can get. And he feels safe, to militarily to remove McClernand. The other thing is he has a commander to replace McClernand. You get out into McClernand's division commanders who would have assumed command of the Corps, of course, and you get like Alvin Hovey and Eugene Carr, who's very sick, and A.J. Smith, who wants to trust him for anything. But it's only when EOC Ord, who is a like-minded major general, Grant friend, Sherman friend, and so on, arrives on June the 18th, that Grant uses this technicality. So with the coming of all the major reinforcements and the arrival of Ord, Grant, I think, sees himself now as safe and will have somebody that can replace him safely. And we've got all these troops and so on. So I think it's safe to do it now. So let's get rid of him here. So he uses this technicality as an excuse to get rid of him, but it is the occasion, not the cause.
Thank you.
But Tim,
Hey,
would you take a few moments and talk about Birdsey McPherson, General McPherson in command at Vicksburg? In your opinion, is he experienced enough to superintend these actions? And what's your assessment of his performance during the Vicksburg campaign?
Well, about all I have to go on McPherson. Of course, he's very low-ranking officer at Shiloh and Fort Donelson, Fort Henry, and all that. Even Corinth, the books I've written beforehand. And so in Vicksburg, really all in depth I have to go on him is during the assaults and the siege. And then I've just finished the manuscript on the Mississippi Central campaign, which he's one of the wing commanders down through Holly Springs and Oxford and so on. And what strikes me about McPherson is that he's steady, but he's not spectacular. He's just kind of there. I think he realizes that he's very inexperienced. I think he realizes that I've been promoted way over what I should be. In fact, when he gets his second star, he says, "What for? What are they promoting me for? I haven't done anything." And the idea I get of McClernand is that he is very much an officer and a gentleman. He's almost too nice to be a good corps commander. He doesn't have that mean streak, that killer instinct that probably is needed. Certainly not that Sherman has. And there have been historians that have argued, that Grant uses these two wisely. When he needs some kind of rough handling, he uses Sherman, but when he needs finesse, he uses McPherson. And so it's interesting to look at that. I'm looking forward when I get into particularly an in-depth study of not only the bio campaigns, but also particularly Raymond and the Overland campaign in Mississippi in May, to examine McPherson more in a little more independent command, particularly Raymond and so on. But as of right now, I can't make any real grand observations about about that. What I am doing though is everywhere I go research, the National Archives or Ohio Historical Society or wherever, I'm always looking for McPherson material, McPherson letters or something, because way down the line when I get through at Vicksburg, I plan to do a McPherson biography. That's one of the major figures that we need a major biography on. So I'm planning eventually to do, unless somebody does it before me, and I may even do it anyway if somebody else does it. But I think there definitely needs to be a McPherson biography, but I do want to wait. And I've thought about, I've done 3 volumes on Vicksburg, and the actual 2 volumes prior to that were Grierson's Raid and then a study of Grant during the Vicksburg campaign. So I've done 5 straight volumes on Vicksburg, and I need just a little bit of a Vicksburg break every once in a while. I've thought about doing McPherson beforehand, but I really want to wait until I get an in-depth view of Raymond and all of that to have that as the backdrop before I do a biography of McPherson. So I am taking a break. I'm working on a new treatment of Albert Sidney Johnston now. So that's giving me a little bit of break on Vicksburg, but I'll very quickly head right back to the bio campaigns of Vicksburg. So
be interesting. I look forward to it. Going back to John Pemberton, bless his heart. I mean, even Mike Ballard couldn't say anything nice about him. And, I think about the only person I've ever seen that's got beaten up worse is maybe Braxton Bragg when Grady McWhinney divorced him and made Judy Halleck write
the second volume.
Second volume of the biography. He couldn't even stomach writing the whole biography about him. And of course, then Pemberton has this apology comes out compelled to appear in print that is discovered and is published 20 years or so ago. Question for you though, should Pemberton have ordered all the civilians out of Vicksburg at the start of the siege, and does him allowing them to remain there does that ensure that Pemberton's going to be starved out, or was this a decision he could have made that he didn't make?
I guess technically he could have. He probably would have had to declare martial law. I'm not sure exactly how that works, but he never declares martial law in Vicksburg. And I'm not sure that you could have removed all the civilians of that. I mean, they're what, 3,500 or so. I mean, that's pretty big bulk of civilians to move. And you get into the whole starving out thing. I'm not convinced that Vicksburg fell because it was starved out. You look at Vicksburg, and the assumption that you're making is that these civilians ate up a lot of the food and so on that could have gone to the soldiers to hold out several more days and so on. When Pemberton surrendered, there was still food in Vicksburg. In fact, I tallied up one time, did some arithmetic. I tell my kids, yeah, you're going to have to do some math, learn it, maybe not algebra or calculus or anything like that, but you need to be able to add and subtract and so on. And I looked up what Pemberton said was on hand that he surrendered in terms of bacon and rice and things like that, and divided it out by what the soldiers were getting, 4 ounces of bacon per day and all that, multiplied it by the whatever 30,000 troops are inside Vicksburg and so on. And Pemberton has about 5 days of rations left when he surrenders. What's really interesting, when Grant comes in then and counts what all they captured, he says, we captured about 4 or 5 days rations in Vicksburg. So, the two add up. And so the question is, why didn't he use that? What he's doing, of course, is he's holding that in reserve in case, and right up until the very end, on July the 1st, July the 2nd, they're still holding out for Joseph E. Johnston to come and save them and to come and attack in Grant's rear. And at the same time, we will attack and break out and join Johnston. But if we do that, we're going to need several days rations in order to carry with us. Because it's a long way to Jackson. It's going to be a 2 or 3 or 4 whatever day march to Jackson. So we got to have those rations. And so Pemberton holds those in reserve, and the surrender comes at the depletion of the ready amount of rations that he can use, not the reserve. And then you get into, could he have held out 5 more days on these rations and so on? Yeah, but what good is that going to do? Then you can't break out then, and you've got to surrender. So what good is that going to do? So my feeling is Vicksburg did not surrender because of a lack of rations per se. It's going to become critical in the next week or so, obviously, but the date of the surrender, there were still rations in Vicksburg. There's still ordnance in terms of weaponry and powder and all of that inside Vicksburg. Pemberton was dug out of Vicksburg instead of being starved out of Vicksburg. The approaches, and this is what we look like at the tour in November. We'll look at the approaches and so on. And by the time Grant reaches right up against the Confederate fortifications with his own approaches, unlike back on the May 19th and 22nd assaults, when they had to cover 300 or 400 yards of ground just to get to the Confederate fortifications, now they are smack right up against them in 30 seconds, and they're over the banks and in the Confederate fortifications. Attendant to that, of course, they're also digging mines and blowing up 3rd Louisiana Redan and digging mines elsewhere. And so Grant, in all that combined, has actually scheduled another assault on July the 6th. And Pemberton realizes we are about to be assaulted, and there is no way we can stop it. Them just right under our nose. There's absolutely no way that we can stop it. So to save bloodshed and all that, it's a done deal at this point if Joe Johnston's not coming. So we might as well go ahead and surrender at this point. So to me, Pemberton is dug out of Vicksburg through the use of these siege mechanisms, the approaches, the saps and mines and so on. He's dug out of Vicksburg rather than starved out of Vicksburg.
Hey, Tim,
Thank you.
how many soldiers did Pemberton surrender? Was it like 33,000? And then,
It's about 29,000 actual on the rolls that you have the parole signed by the soldiers. It's 29 something, 29 and some change. Of course, there are a lot of civilians, and you know, getting back to the civilian thing about why didn't Pemberton get them out of town and so on. Pemberton depends on a lot of these civilians. They're civilian engineers, they're civilian quartermaster workers, and so on. So a lot of the civilians in Vicksburg are actually employed by the Army and are put to work. So Pemberton actually needs these. So if he gets rid of them, you know, that could be a problem as well. So what the grand total inside Vicksburg, civilian and soldier, I would guess would probably reach up to 34, 33, 34, 35,000. But actual soldiers that signed parole, I think, is 29 something.
and what's
And-
the
Okay.
when they surrendered, was the Dix Hill agreement about exchange of prisoners, was that still in place?
Yes, it was. And that's the debate on whether we send them to prison camps or whether we just parole them here and let them go to their own parole camps. And this is one of the we'll call it lie or whatever in Grant's memoirs. He said, you know, I wanted to, let's see, how did he get it? He was opposite from all of his other people. All of his other generals, except Frederick Steele, wanted to parole, and Grant wanted to send them to prison camps. But everybody argued that and Porter included, that it would be so much easier just to parole them here because they're under the Dix Hill cartel. You only had certain places where they could go to be exchanged. And so if we transport them northward to prison camps, then we're probably going to have to transport them over to Richmond or wherever the place is in the east, because, you know, Vicksburg is no longer tenable to the Confederates and so on. And so you're going to have to transport them all the way over the north just to get them paroled and exchanged, when you can just do that now. And the hope is, of course, that they'll all just go home and not even be exchanged, not even rejoin the Confederate Army. And in large part, that, or not large part, but in some cases, that's exactly what happened.
Okay, folks, I got one last question. We'll wrap up. Norm Dazinger has a question, and that will be the last question tonight. So go ahead, Norm.
Hey, all right. Hey, I like one of the guys I'm interested in is Van Dorn. And it was a weak leader. Pemberton, I think, kind of made weaker when Van Dorn was transferred to Tennessee. I can kind of imagine Van Dorn causing some havoc on Grant's line of march and his supplies as he moved across Mississippi after he landed there at Bruinsburg. Tim, do you think the presence of Van Dorn when Grant landed and moved east would have made any difference in his thoughts concerning that dangerous and risky track that he made toward Vicksburg?
You mean in Grant's thoughts?
Yeah, and Grant's thoughts.
Never really thought about it from that perspective. But I can't see much of anything changing Grant's thoughts. You know, I think Grant probably would have gone on, and probably he expects there to be a fair amount of Confederate cavalry anyway, which there was not, because Van Dorn, as you said, in January, after this great raid that he had conducted in December to Holly Springs and back, Joseph E. Johnston sends him to Bragg's army in Tennessee. And so, you know, you would think there would be cavalry there anyway, Confederate cavalry, and it's just Grant's fortune that it was not. The bigger issue here probably is that Van Dorn's movement eastward to Tennessee, and the Union commanders actually talk about this. They talk about what a gift we're given, and this will allow us then to launch the Grierson's Raid. What we know of is Grierson's Raid, because there's no comparable Confederate cavalry left in Mississippi, because they've all gone to Bragg's army in Tennessee to combat this. So we can make this raid, and we can get down there and wreak havoc and get out. And that's, of course, exactly what they do. So, and of course, the other assumption is that Van Dorn would have left the ladies alone enough to conduct his cavalry operations, which is not a given either, I don't think so.
Well, folks, we have come and gone. The hour has come and gone, and it is the bewitching hour. It's a little after 9 o'clock. Tim, I really appreciate your taking the time to speak so candidly with us.
It's been a
You can get
pleasure,
a lot of
been fun.
information out in an hour.
Well, I talk fast sometimes. So.
And for those of y'all who are interested, we'll soon have the registration for this program up online at our website. And for those of you who are also interested, there was a question about New Orleans and so forth. Immediately before Tim's program, those who fly into New Orleans and drive up, I'm going to do New Orleans and the 1862 fighting for New Orleans and also the 1815. So if you have an interest, you can get a twofer. You can come into New Orleans, catch mine, and then drive 150 miles north to Vicksburg, and you can pick up Tim's program there. So Tim, again, thanks very much. You folks who joined us, thank you. Those of you who would like to see this interview again, it will be posted up in a few days on the website. So have a great time. Have a great night.